Isaiah 53. What we're looking at today is Isaiah 53 from the skeptic's viewpoint. The agnostic, the unbeliever, the atheist. How do they, when they look at Isaiah 53, how do they look at it? Because what we have said is that Isaiah 53 is a prediction of the Messiah. That 700 BC, the prophet of God said, my servant is coming. And you have the birth, the life, the work, the death, the trial around the death, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection, and the ascending on high and the reigning from heaven from there on. You have all of that in the 15 verses that surround the suffering servant of Isaiah 52, verse 13, 14, 15, Isaiah chapter 53. Now, Isaiah 53, and so when I say Isaiah 53, I am including the other three. Isaiah 53 has always been understood as a messianic prophecy, a prediction that one was coming. And everybody knew that Isaiah had been written in 700 BC. That's a given in the mindset of the Jew and in the mindset of a believer. However, not everybody believes that. But there are certain things on the scene that help us to see that there are enough pieces of information for us to recognize that Isaiah 53 was written before Christ was born, long before he was born. But I wanted you to see the facts before you simply take in the, okay, let's see how what you're saying is right or wrong. Isaiah 53, you have, I'm going to start with verse 48 because it does say why God gives prophecy. By the way, there are 333 prophecies according to the Christian viewpoint of the coming Messiah in the Old Testament. There are over 400 prophecies of the coming Messiah according to the way that the Jews would look at it. You have in Isaiah 48, verse 4, because I knew that thou art obstinate, said God to Israel, and that thy neck is iron sinew, and thy brow and your eyebrows brass. What does he mean by calling, what's he saying? They're hard-hearted. They're hard-hearted. Therefore, since I knew that, therefore I have declared it to thee from of old. Before it came to pass, I showed it thee, lest thou shouldest say, mine idol hath done it, my graven image and my molten image hath commanded them. I told you these things ahead of time because I knew what kind of heart you have, and I knew that when it came to pass, you would then ascribe it to your idols, to your gods. And so I told you ahead so you would know it was Jehovah that did it. Verse 8, yea, thou heardest not, yea, thou knewest not, yea, from old thine ear was not opened. For I knew that thou art one that would deal very treacherously. Verse 11, my glory will I not give to another. We have emphasized the last part of that God is not trying to brag on himself. That's usually the accusation when you read something like this, that God is bragging on himself. But when you see the context, what God is saying is, look, you need to understand as human beings that I, Jehovah, exist. I'm not made up. I'm not an invention of human beings. I'm not an imagination of somebody. I really exist. And I'm going to give you pieces of evidence upon pieces of evidence upon pieces of evidence. And you're going to be able to determine by the evidence, as you put it together, you're going to be able to conclude that I, Jehovah, exist and there are no gods besides me. Now if, and this is the problem, that if you think the gods are God, you're going to deteriorate as a human being. You're going to become evil. Psalm 115, you will become as your gods. And when you look around at the gods, you see the human beings, their morals, their ethics, their spirituality is nowhere near what you're reading in the Bible. Understood from the Bible, not interpreted by those who don't like what the Bible has to say. But from what the Bible has to say, there's a great distinction between what the Bible says, what people think the Bible says, what the gods have produced among pagans and others. And God says, look, I have said all of this. I've done all of this so that you can know. That you can know that you know who God is. He's not trying to hide. He's trying to make it known. So the problem is not what God has said. And the problem is not how God said it. It's a matter of, watch the passage. Your ears were not open. Your ears were not open. I think it's important to understand that that includes that your ears are not open to what Isaiah said, and your ears are not open to what Luke had to say in Acts. There are some 66 books in the totality of the Old and New Testament. God wrote those things. God is the author of that. And the whole counsel of God, the sum of thy word is truth, wrote David the psalmist. You can't pick and choose. As a preacher, as a teacher, as a Christian, I can't say, hey, I like that, but I don't like that. I've got to say, why does God want me to do this and not that? And I've got to follow what the Bible has to say. Well, in Isaiah is pointing out that I have predicted the Messiah, among other things. I have predicted the Messiah so that you can know that you know that I exist. Some of the thoughts from the skeptics are these. Isaiah 53 is not talking about a Messiah. It's talking about Israel. You understand what they just said? Isaiah 53 is not talking about a suffering servant. By the way, did you notice verse 4? He is wounded for our transgression. He is bruised for our iniquities. Did you hear the plural? I mean the singular? He. And so what is the skeptic going to do with that? They do something with that. Isaiah 53 is probably the most often used prophecy that is claimed by Christian apologists, said one, to refer to Jesus. But the context indicates otherwise. It doesn't refer to Jesus. The suffering servant that is referred to here is Israel, not Jesus. Where'd you get that? There was a fellow who believed in the Bible in the year 184, 250, in that time frame. His name was Origen. Origen ran across this argument back some 1,700 years ago. And he related it. He's in a discussion with 3rd century skeptics, Jews, and he notes that they are a group of wise Jews. I quoted these prophecies, to which my Jewish opponent replied that these predictions bore reference to the whole people regarded as one individual. Did you hear the argument? Yes, it says he was wounded. Yes, it says he was bruised. Yes, as a lamb he was led to the slaughter. It does use a singular, but it is using a singular, an individual, in order to refer to the nation. How do you answer that? Well, you answer it with what the Bible says. Note with me, Origen would answer with Isaiah 53:8. He could answer with several things, but read with me Isaiah 53:8. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who among them considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. I'm going to read it again, but I'm going to cut down the reading. He was cut off for the transgression of my people. If the he is my people, then what Isaiah says, my people were cut off from my people. It doesn't work, does it? You will also notice in verse 11, and this is an important point to add to that because they could go further with it, that it says, my righteous servant bore the sins. Here's why I added that. The skeptic may come back and say, well, the people bore the sins of the people who were wicked. But there's no place in the passage that says there were any good people. But it does say, my righteous servant. If that's the people, then why are the people dying for their transgressions? They have none. They're all righteous. You have to twist what is being said in order to come out with the concept that Isaiah 53 is speaking of Israel. It's not. It's speaking of the Messiah. In the first century, Acts chapter 8, you have one of the greatest of historians. His name is Luke. He wrote out of Isaiah, Acts chapter 8, that the eunuch was reading this particular passage. Watch what he asked. Is he speaking of himself? Said the eunuch, who didn't fully understand Christianity, who had been to Jerusalem to worship, had read Isaiah 53, and said, in that day and that time, of whom speaketh the prophet? Of himself or of some other person? So in the first century, the concept of Isaiah 53 was either Isaiah or some other righteous servant of God. But the thought was not Israel. You have to bring that into effect much, much later. Yeah, but Ron, how did the Jews look at it? Most Jews, the dominant view of Isaiah 53 was that it is speaking of the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed, the Christ, the anointed, the Messiah, the anointed. Only later did they come out with the idea that, no, it's speaking of Israel. You can go all the way up to the 11th century and you can read a variety of rabbis in their writings, the Talmud, the Midrash. You can read all of those writings and you can see that they looked at this passage basically and dominantly as the Messiah. Notice with me a second skeptic's thought on the passage. We're looking basically at the text. Is her phone ringing? The second argument is Isaiah uses the past tense. Isaiah uses the past tense in the text. By the way, a lot of these arguments that you hear, and I'm not giving you all, certainly not giving you all of them in one day. A lot of these arguments are, I don't like the way he wrote that. I wouldn't have written it that way. Have you ever noticed that's what skeptics do? That's one of the first things they do. Isaiah said, Matthew said, Mark said, and then they say, he should have said. What you just told me is you didn't like the way he said it. What you need to do is read it and understand what he said, and then go from there. We studied that out of Matthew chapter 2, where a skeptic said, Matthew made a mistake because he misread and misquoted Malachi when he said that Jesus was to be born in Bethlehem. Wait a minute, skeptic. Reread it. Matthew said, the Jews said that's where he was born. There's a big difference in those two things. By the way, Matthew would have said he was born in Bethlehem too. But he didn't quote it right, Ron. Well, he didn't do the quoting. The Jews of that day were the ones that quoted it. We're now looking at past tense. Here's the argument. Lastly, a prophecy is, by definition, a prediction of a future event. Yet the bulk of this particular narrative is in the past tense. And he now goes through all the passages. He was wounded for our transgression. He was bruised. And I agree with every one of them. They're in the past tense. Wouldn't even argue for a half a second. I wouldn't give the reason for what I believe for a half a second. That indeed it's past tense. And Isaiah is obviously speaking of someone who has already existed and interacted with humanity, since it's in past tense. In Isaiah's time, Jesus was still more than 700 years in the future. Stop and just think just a second. Do you hear what the skeptic just admitted? He just admitted, of course, it could be the fact that he's just saying that in order to make his argument. I realize that. But he did say, Isaiah says what he says 700 years before Jesus was born. Well, skeptic, I agree with you. He did say that 700 years. But that's not what you believe. And if you do believe that, then you need to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. We go further. To interpret references expressed in the past tense as predictions of a future that is centuries away requires stretching poetic license to its limit. I'm glad he put it that way. If you're going to go 700 years and put it in the past tense, man, you have really stretched poetic license. What did he just admit? He just admit there is such a thing as poetic license. He just didn't like 700 years. Well, wait a minute, Mr. Skeptic. Well, suppose I do it for 7 years. Is that okay? Well, that's a lot better poetic license than what you've done, Isaiah. You see what's wrong with the argument that he's making? And you see why in his own comments, there are problems. We have to understand that there are such things as literary devices. If we fail to understand there are such things as literary devices in the writing in all languages, and I'm using that figuratively, I don't know all languages. There are such things as literary devices. I went on the internet and I found 3 different writers that would talk about literary devices. Would you now like to discuss 3 different writers talking about 31 literary devices, 45 literary devices, 75? No, you wouldn't, would you? But let me introduce one of them to you. Point of view. Point of view. A writer can use a literary device called point of view. Let's look at things the way God looks at things, okay? Now, I don't know who your God is, as y'all listen to me on the video. I don't know who your God is. But I'll tell you, the God that I serve is the one that named the 15LH. Did y'all hear me rename that a little bit? The J2157. And those are pretty good things to rename for me. God calls the names of all the stars. The God that I serve is an amazing, amazing being and person. He is above comprehension. And the reason we know anything about God is because he revealed it. And he has revealed some of who he is by prophecy. And he has the ability, from his point of view, to see the future as history. If you recall Isaiah 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, we went over those chapters. We went over the verses where God said that repeatedly, that he is the one that can call the future as history. We started out with Isaiah 48 and pointed out, therefore I have declared it from of old, before it came to pass, I showed it thee that thou shouldn't say, mine idol, my graven image, my molten image. So God has already forewarned the people of Israel, look, I know the future. I can see the future. I may not understand what that means fully and totally. I do know what it means with the book of Isaiah and with prophecy. It means that God is able to predict what's going to happen to Jesus. God is able to predict what's going to happen to you and me. He doesn't predict that, but he does predict and did predict what's going on with the Messiah. Isaiah 53. And he used a literary device called point of view, an understood literary device. Wait a minute, Ron, we don't use it in that way. No, you don't. But God did. God did because he could. By the way, the literary device is from Hannah Munez, who I do not know. She has a master's degree, a bachelor's degree, and she teaches English on a university level. Yeah, but Ron, you don't understand point of view. Okay. God is timeless. His word is timeless. And therefore he can write in a timeless way. Number 3. Isaiah predicts the one on trial will be totally silent. Notice with me, chapter 53, verse 7. This is the accusation from the skeptic. Isaiah predicts the one on trial will be totally silent. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, reading from the man's writing. Yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb. So he opened not his mouth. The writer continues. Twice Isaiah declares that the afflicted person, stop just a second, this skeptic said person, not nation. Twice Isaiah declares that the afflicted person opened not his mouth. However, only in the book of Mark is Jesus completely silent. You see his argument? Only in the book of Mark is Jesus completely silent during his trial and punishment. In Matthew, he speaks only 2 words. In Luke, he speaks multiple verses to the weeping crowd following him to Calvary. And in John, Jesus has 2 conversations with Pilate, including the one, "My kingdom is not of this earth" speech. If the books of Luke and John are true, Jesus certainly did open his mouth repeatedly. How would you answer the man? The argument's pretty simple. Isaiah said he opened not his mouth. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John said he opened his mouth. That's a contradiction. It's not true. It's a false prophecy. How would you answer him? This would be where I'd like for David to have a microphone, but I would like for him to have had a little bit of warning before I would call upon him. And David says, "Oh, I want to answer it anyway." Go ahead.
Okay, there we are.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was thinking, I wish I had the microphone. My first thought would be, okay, do you equate opening mouth with literally going, you know?
He does, yeah, he does. You're exactly right. Go ahead.
Because obviously he would say, well, no, I don't mean you can't literally just open your mouth. Okay, well then let's define what he means by opening his mouth.
Exactly. Very good. Keep going.
And it would mean defending yourself, not talking to anybody. That's, I don't know if you can see me while you're saying that. I was just shaking my head.
I could, but that's good. Way to go. Who's been teaching you? Your dad and your mom?
My daughter, Elliot, I think.
Okay, what David has just brought out, and he's exactly right. And I pointed it out to you at the very beginning, and you're going to hear skeptics and agnostics and atheists do this repeatedly. And that is, they will say, he shouldn't have written it like that. He should have written it this way. What David pointed out to you is that you have a figure of speech. What's wrong with having a figure of speech? I have said all the time, that's figure of speech. I said, every language, that's figure of speech. I have said that the Bible is filled with figures of speech, especially the book of Isaiah. Figures of speech intensify what you're saying. Figures of speech put a picture in front of you. But a figure of speech, you've got to understand what the writer is writing. not what you want him to write, not how you're trying to interpret what he's writing, not what you're trying to do in order to entrap him. You must hear what a writer is saying. I don't care whether he's an atheist or agnostic. You have to hear what he's conveying with the language that he's conveying. You have to understand his definition of things when you're listening to him. If you have a different definition, you work out that definition. You don't simply ascribe your definition to his words and then you start saying, see, it's wrong. No, his definition may indeed be wrong. So you're trying to figure out how to get the proper definitions in the words so that you two can communicate. You can't communicate if you're not using the same definition. Mr. Skeptic is not using the same definition, and David pointed it out in an excellent way. Isaiah actually tells you what he means, that he is using a figure of speech. He just said in the text, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, as sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. So, Isaiah, what are you saying? I'm saying, look, as shepherds in Jerusalem, in Judea, all you have to do is pay attention to the shepherds and how they see them all the time, all day long, they have to see what is going on with the sheep. What is happening? Now, I've never seen a sheep get sheared. Have you? You did? I had to read, so I had to have book knowledge. You got good experience. Well, anyway, I watched, said an individual, I watched a sheep shearer that I really thought about these words. A sheep might wildly fight when a shepherd brings him into the shearer pen, but once that sheep is flipped so he can be sheared, he is quiet and docile. Isaiah said, as a sheep, he's telling you his figure of speech. He knows. Of course, I think God is the one that wrote it. He knows the argument that's going to be made, and he's helping you. Well, he should have said it a different way. I think he said it pretty good, but that's just me. As a sheep before his shearers is quiet and docile. Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, with all the power of eternity, at the blink of an eye, could have wiped out every single soldier and every ruler that was in his path. He didn't. That is quiet and as docile as can be. That's the point that Isaiah is making. And that's the point I think that the Ethiopian eunuch, the eunuch from Ethiopia, understood as well. One writer said, quote, he's quoting the passages with his translation, it suffered itself to be led, that is the sheep. It is passive, and it is speaking of sheep, which is neuter. So what Bingle is pointing at, what the commentator is pointing out is this, that Isaiah is using the neuter gender, since he's talking about sheep, and he's talking about, look, here's how the sheep are. So the figure of speech comes from the idea of sheep.